If you've hung out in yoga circles and meditation centers of any type, I'm sure you've experienced the smile or die personality. This is the person when you walk in the room who forces a smile. You're not sure if they'll laugh or if they'll cry. They give you a hug that's a little too strong. And even though on the outside they might look happy, in air quotes, very clearly you can see that they're suffering on the inside. And this tendency to cover up pain with smiles, to cover up tragedy with laughter, is really rampant in mind-body health circles, and it's really destructive. In fact, there's research to show that it can actually have the opposite effect. This overriding of your true feelings can actually bounce back and make you less happy. On this week's show, we'll talk about emotional agility. In my career, I've spent almost every waking moment looking at physical health and wellness, something I struggled with, something I've been interested in. So movement and food and diet, nutrition, sleep, and all these kinds of things. And for many years, I really overlooked emotional health, and emotional health is so much more important. How you feel is so much more important than how you look. How you feel is so much more important than what you have. How you feel is really everything. And so if you wake up in the morning and you have nothing but you feel awesome and you're optimistic and you're light and supported and loved, and it's really great. And I don't think that I've thought about it enough, and I wonder if you have. Hopefully you'll get some good insights on this week's show. Your questions, comments, feedback, always most welcome. Email me, podcast@yogabody.com. Enjoy the show. So hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to the Lucas Rockwood Show. Today's show is called Emotional Agility, and I am joined here with Susan David, PhD. Susan is a psychologist. She's on faculty at Harvard Medical School. She's the co-founder and co-director of the Institute of Coaching at McLean Hospital, and she's the CEO of Evidence-Based Psychology. As a speaker and consultant, Susan has worked with senior leadership at hundreds of organizations, including the UN, Ernst & Young, and the World Economic Forum. Her work has been featured in the Harvard Business Review, Time, Fast Company, and the Wall Street Journal, among others. While we're chatting today, you can find out about her book and her work at susandavid.com. Susan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Maybe we could start with a basic definition, this emotional agility term that you've coined. Help us understand what that means.
Absolutely. So a core focus of my work is really on a single question, and the question is this: what does it take internally in the way we deal with our thoughts, our emotions, and also the stories that we tell ourselves that help us to thrive in the world? Because as it turns out, how we deal with our inner world drives everything. It drives how we come to our parenting, how we come to our own health, how we interact in our careers and in the workplace. In fact, how we deal with our inner world impacts on every aspect of how we love and how we live, how we parent, and how we lead. And really, my work focuses on these ideas. And in speaking about emotional agility, really the questions that I'm asking are, what does it take in order for us to be effective with our inner world? And so emotional agility, very simply defined, is the ability for us as human beings to be with what are very often messy thoughts, emotions, experiences, because living is not perfection. Living isn't only about positivity. And so we experience these messy thoughts, emotions, experiences every single day. And emotional agility is about our ability to be with these in ways that are healthy. And that often involves a number of aspects. It involves being able to be compassionate with ourselves. It involves being able to be courageous with ourselves, because often we come face to face with something that we don't like about who we are or how our life is going. And it also involves being able to be curious, because when we're curious with our thoughts, our emotions, and our stories, we're able to learn. And then what we also need to be able to do is to be able to take values-connected steps, so that even if something feels uncomfortable, even if it feels uncomfortable having a particular conversation, but it's an important conversation to have, if that discomfort still brings us into a space where we're connected with our values, that we can move forward in that way. So that's emotional agility, the ability to be with ourselves in ways that are curious, courageous, and compassionate, and to take values-connected steps so that we can be the best of ourselves.
I know that you talk a lot about finding your underlying motivation. There's the famous Nietzsche quote, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." And I'm curious, when you think about the inner world versus the outer world, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, how important is this for people to find a why? Most people don't have a why. They're just stumbling through life with their job and their family, and I've certainly done that at different points in my life. How do we find that why?
Yes, I think this is critical. And when I think of a why, I'm not often thinking of, a singular driving purpose, because I think that for all of us, this can put an enormous pressure on ourselves. It's like, oh, what's my singular purpose? Like I have, as an individual, many different purposes, and I have really what I'm connecting with often when I think about a why is, what are your values? Like, what is the heartbeat of who you want to be as a person? So for some people, values might be values around collaboration, or values might be values around fairness. And this, as it turns out, is actually fundamental to how we live effectively. So there are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, human beings are subject to what is called social contagion. Social contagion is the idea that when everyone's buying a lot, we want to buy a lot. When people are driving nice cars, we want to drive nice cars. When we see things on Instagram where people are having these wonderful vacations, we are naturally drawn into the process of comparing ourselves to people, and very often, without even realizing, adjusting our behaviors. So in fascinating research, we know, for instance, that if someone in your social network gets divorced or puts on weight, you might not even know that person. They literally might be 2 or 3 degrees of separation from you. But you are more likely to get divorced or put on weight. And so listeners might say, how does that happen? But we've all been in a situation where we're trying to be healthy, for instance, and we go out to dinner and one person orders dessert, and so we all order dessert. Or when you're in an elevator and someone's looking at their phone, and now we pull out our phone. So what happens as human beings is that we all start to, in very, very insidious ways, pick up emotions and behaviors from other people. And so all of a sudden you look back and you're like, I'm living this life, but it's not a life that I chose. Or I'm in a career, but it's not a career that's working for me. And often we've been influenced in ways that we didn't even appreciate. And so what we know is what protects us from social contagion is when people have their values front and center. What I mean by values front and center is even spending 10 minutes thinking about, okay, there's all this chaos going on in the workplace. Who do I want to be in the context of this chaos? What kind of parent do I want to be? And just even spending 10 minutes writing down or thinking about, what is the heartbeat of your values, who you want to be in the world? We know that protects us from the impact of social contagion. So this is really important. And I can speak more to it. We know even that knowing what your values are impacts on the physics of willpower. It impacts on how we achieve our goals. And I'll give you a very simple example, which is, imagine you trying to lose weight, as an example, but this could be applied to any context. And you have a have-to goal. A have-to goal is a goal that is derived very often out of a sense of shame or obligation. I have to lose weight because my doctor's at me, or I have to lose weight because I see an image in a magazine and I feel now terrible about myself. So have-to goals are goals that are often derived out of a sense of shame or obligation, or because people are telling us that we need to do this particular thing. So you've got a have-to goal, and it's something that you set and you try to achieve it. And what we know is that have-to goals actually ramp up temptation, and they make us less likely to achieve the goal. So you've got a have-to goal of losing weight. You go to the refrigerator, you open the refrigerator, there's chocolate cake in there. All you see is the chocolate cake. All you want is the chocolate cake. So in a really interesting way, when we set a goal that's a have-to goal, we actually are less likely to achieve it because it makes us want the thing that we can't have and to resist that goal. Now take that very simple goal of losing weight, simple but not easy, and if you connect that goal with a value of yours, I want to lose weight because I value family and I want to see my children grow up. This now becomes what I call a want-to goal. A want-to goal is derived not out of shame and obligation, but through an intrinsic sense of what's important to us. And you look at this want-to goal, and what we find is when people have want-to goals that are connected with their values, it ramps down temptation. It enhances our ability to have greater levels of willpower, and these goals are more sustainable. So in very, very important ways, connecting with the heartbeat of who we are as human beings, what we want to be, and our why is actually critical to all aspects of our health and well-being and our careers and relationships.
And if we took that example of to be healthy, family is important. So if you want to be healthy for your family, is the stronger motivator that you want to be healthy or the fear of getting sick? From the research that I've seen, fear is often the stronger motivator than any kinds of reward. So I'm just curious about, well, let's take an example. In yoga and meditation classes, the first thing people say is clear your mind. Don't think about anything. Don't think about the elephant in the room. And the first thing you think about is the elephant in the room, whatever that is for you. And so it's very difficult to control your mind. So in terms of positioning, in terms of your values, I go back and forth. Should we dig into our pain and fear, or should we try to lean into the reward, the carrot at the end of the stick? How do you think about reward versus fear and pain?
Yeah, so I think both are powerful. There's a lot of research that shows that approach goals, what I'll get if I achieve this particular outcome, is very powerful. But aversive goals, in other words, what I'm going to avoid, an early death, that can also be very powerful. But I think, both of those goals, approach goals and avoidance goals, both of them can be underpinned by a sense of values. So my avoidance goal, I want to avoid dying at a very young age so that my children can't, I want my children to be with me and I want to be able to be a parent to them. That's an avoidance goal. An approach goal might be a goal like, I want to lose weight because I want to be around with my children and I want to connect with them and I want to be able to forge a future with them. Both of those goals, one's approach, one's avoidance. But in both of those goals, what makes the goal more likely to be achieved is being able to connect with this very fundamental sense of why this thing is important to us, the value that underpins it. So in both of those instances, being able to be an experience in a particular way with my family. But what you described earlier, actually, this really fundamental idea, and I think this is something that I talk to a lot in Emotional Agility, and I also talk about in my TED Talk, The Gifts and Power of Emotional Courage, is that we live in a society where often, especially when it comes to difficult emotions, people might say things like, well, just be positive. If you're feeling bad about something, if you're feeling upset about something, just be positive. It'll be okay. And one of the things that I question is this notion. We know that a focus on positivity and just pursuing happiness is actually associated with lower levels of well-being, lower levels of happiness, and lower levels of resilience. And why is that? Because what it does is it starts to engage us in unhealthy ways with our emotions. If you're feeling upset about something, that upset may be your body, your psychology's way of telling you, gee, things aren't going as well in the workplace as you were hoping. Or you feel guilty as a parent. Gee, being present and connected with my children is really important. And so one of the things that I talk about in Emotional Agility and in my TED Talk is this idea that our emotions, including our most difficult emotions, contain signposts of the things that we care about. And when we push aside our difficult emotions or our difficult thoughts in the service of some kind of forced positivity, we fail to learn from them, and it's ineffective. So what you described earlier about that elephant in the room, don't think about your day, we know that this is this idea called amplification, that when people say, well, I'm unhappy in my job, but at least I've got a job, or, gee, I feel really bad here about this situation, but I'm just going to be positive. It's not that thought or emotion goes away. It actually comes back. It comes back stronger. It starts taking hold of us. And most importantly, we're not actually learning from it. We're not saying, what is the value? What is the important signal here that is underneath this that I can learn from and that can help me to shape my future effectively? Oh, I feel guilty as a parent. that's showing me our value, presence, and connectedness, and things are a bit out of whack lately. How can I bring more of that value into my interactions? Or, gee, I'm miserable in my work. What is the value that this being miserable is connecting with? It's connecting with the fact that growth is important to me and I'm experiencing a lack of growth. How can I make small changes that bring growth more effectively into my workplace, either in its current format, or what changes do I need to make? And so really what I promote in emotional agility is this idea that we live in a society that tells us that we've got good emotions and bad emotions, and that only the good ones, the happiness and the joy, should be allowed. But what I really believe and what the research supports is that this is an unhealthy way of being, that we've got to be able to, as humans, expand our hearts to the fullness and the wholeness of the human experience and to understand what our thoughts and emotions are trying to message to us. It doesn't mean that they're always right, but that they contain messages.
That reframe of the frustrated position at work is such an interesting one, because as soon as you share this idea of someone who's bored or frustrated or hates their job, immediately that's someone I don't want to be around. That's someone with negative energy. But as soon as that same person says, one of my core values is growth, and I'm not growing at work, I need to find something new, suddenly that's an interesting person. That's a really exciting person to be around. And so looking for those creative solutions, I'd never heard it reframed that way. But really quickly you can see what a positive influence that is in our lives.
Yeah, so it connects a little bit with what we spoke about right now, which is this idea that we do live in a society in which we often believe that emotions are good or bad, positive or negative, and that we should just be positive. And what that does is it leads us into, unhealthy relationships with ourselves, because in reality, life's beauty and life's fragility are interwoven. The other side of success is disappointment. The other side of love is grief. The other side of being a parent is a sense of loss, because you know that your child will grow up and move on. And so when we have a society that really just promotes this idea that only one way of being is okay, what it does is it actually undermines our ability to deal with the world as it is, not as we wish it to be, but as it is, which is a simultaneously beautiful and fragile world. And so what I'm talking about in showing up is the idea that as human beings, in order to become practiced and to become agile and connected with the world as it is, and to learn and to grow and to thrive, we actually need to open our hearts to the fullness of the emotional experience. And so this is about showing up, is really about this idea that instead of, on the one hand, often what we do when we experience difficult emotions or thoughts is we might bottle those. We push them aside. We say, I'm not going to go there. I'm unhappy in a relationship, but I'm just not going to think about it. Or I'm unhappy at work, but I'm just not going to go there. Or what we might do is we might brood on those experiences. We get so stuck in our story of cynicism or failure or difficult or victimhood that we struggle to move forward. And so what I talk about in showing up is really this very, very powerful idea that acceptance of our emotions, which is not about passive resignation, it's about opening our hearts and breathing into both the difficult and the easy emotions. That acceptance is actually, for all human beings, the prerequisite to change. It's only when we show up to ourselves and we say, this is where I'm at. I might not like where I'm at, but this is where I'm at. It's when we move into that space that we're able to move on from that. And so showing up is really about ending the struggle that you might have with, oh, that's a good emotion, that's a bad emotion, I should be feeling that, I shouldn't be feeling that, judging ourselves for experiencing things, and instead breathing into it and saying, this is how I'm feeling. And then with that also comes particular tools that are important. For instance, so often people will describe their emotions using very black and white labels. They might come home from work, or they might be experiencing difficulty in life, and they might say something like, I'm stressed, and everything becomes, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed. Now, what we know from the research, and I've found this in my own research, is that when we say I'm stressed, it doesn't really allow us to understand the causes and the consequences and why you're experiencing that emotion. So there's a world of difference between stress and disappointment, or stress and that gnawing feeling of, I'm in the wrong career. So when you take this emotion that feels very big and very diffuse, and you just give it a more accurate label. So you say, what is this? Oh, it's disappointment. Oh, it's anxiety. Oh, it's betrayal. You take that emotion and you label it more accurately. It's incredibly powerful. What we know from the research is that this labeling allows us to understand why we're feeling what we're feeling. It helps to tap into what I mentioned earlier, our values and our why. And it also has, in our brains, it starts to activate what's called the readiness potential in our brains, the part of our brain that helps to move us to action. Gee, I need to get my CV together, or gee, I need to have this conversation. So the simple strategy of labeling emotions effectively is associated with very profound impact in our day-to-day, but is also associated over time with greater levels of well-being and greater levels of resilience, because you are able to move into a space where you're developing a fluid set of skills with, how am I feeling? What do I need to do about the situation? Rather than, oh, I just don't want to go there, or gee, I'm so stuck in this space that I can't move on from it. And so as it turns out, labeling of our emotions is critical for all human beings, including children. When we look at the research on parenting and we see parents who are able to help their children to not experience emotions as good or bad, you're angry, go to your room and come out when you've got a smile on your face, but rather to experience their emotions as they just are, and let's label them and understand them, those children grow up to have higher levels of well-being and high levels of resilience. So it's very powerful. And so the principle of showing up is really, in sum, about being able to be with our emotions in ways that are not judgy, rather in ways that are willing and open and compassionate, and then starting to label them.
So if I understand these labels correctly, someone who might say, I feel stressed, I feel overwhelmed, instead they might unpack that and say, I feel insignificant, and one of my core values is feeling significant. Or I feel stuck, and one of my core values is feeling growth. Am I more or less on track?
Correct. That our difficult emotions are often signposting things that we care about. And so if we can start saying, I am feeling insignificant, you move beyond this big thing that feels, stress, into I feel insignificant. So what's attached with insignificant? Insignificant is I feel unseen, or it might be insignificant is I'm making a contribution, but I feel that contribution isn't actually the contribution that I want to be making in the world. And that's really, really powerful, beautiful information to have about yourself, because it allows you then to say, how can I increase my being seen? Do I need to be connecting with people more? Do I need to be reaching out with people more? Or how do I increase my contribution? What does this look like? And one of the things that I talk about a lot in emotional agility is I talk about this principle of tiny tweaks, that often, again, we live in a society where people say things like, give up and go sell up and go live on a wine farm in France and, make these massive changes. But we know that as human beings, some of the most profound, powerful, impactful changes that we can make are the small changes, the tiny tweaks, the shifts in our habits, the shifts in our routines, the shifts in who we're interacting with, what we're putting our hands up for, the shift of not bringing your cell phone to the table when you've got precious time with your loved ones. It's these small changes. And so if you can start saying, well, what is this emotion pointing to? Oh, it's pointing to significance. What does that look like? And what small changes can I make in my life that enable me to make a move towards that value of significance, that's powerful. And that's not born from the place of, oh, I just need to be positive. It's not even born from the place of reframing our thinking into positive thinking. Really what it's born from is coming into a space of emotional truth with ourselves and compassion with ourselves and being willing to learn from our own heartbeat so that we can move forward in our lives in ways that are meaningful.
In terms of discovering your core values, I actually did a workshop recently with some colleagues. It was really challenging for myself and for the others to try to figure out what our core values were. Initially, people throw out this corporate speak where they say things like truth and honesty and follow through. It takes quite a long time to figure out what your true core values are, and we spent quite a bit of time. So I'm curious how you can help listeners uncover their core values. I just thought I'd share one thing. One of my colleagues' core values that he revealed after many hours was promptness. Being on time is super important to him as a value, that someone's on time and that he's on time. And I thought that was so strange and so interesting. It was really quite a big discovery for him because it's a pretty small ask of the people in your life, and it's a pretty simple thing to follow through on to fulfill his core values. My core values tend to be a little bit more complex, but still, it's an interesting exercise.
Yeah, so really, really great question. A lot of times values can have this very abstract feel to them. You know, if you work in any kind of corporation, it's the things that are put on walls that everyone tells us we need to believe in. And so values can often seem abstract or almost like an afterthought. The way that I think of values is that values are qualities of action. Values are ways of being. So for instance, if I've got a value around health, I walk out of a meeting and I've got a choice, and that choice point is one towards my value of fruit or away from my value where I might pick up the muffin. So the idea, the way that I think of values is they're qualities of action, and it's almost like, you know, when you ride a bike, the only way to move forward is to move forward in action. And yet, at the same time, values are so powerful, but in the exact way you describe, a lot of times people describe difficulties with their values. So one of the most common ones that I hear from people, and I think it's completely understandable, is people often say things like, you know, what if my values are in conflict? What if I simultaneously value the most common one I hear is my career, but I also value my parenting, you know, being with my children. And so often what can happen is we then feel like we're in a no-win situation. You know, like I value my career, but then I've got this value that's in conflict, which is I value my family. Now, the way that I think of values is that your values just are. You know, your values just are. It's not that they're wrong or right. They just are. So just like facets of a diamond, when the diamond is facing you, you might have one value that's front and center, but it doesn't mean that the rest of the diamond doesn't exist. So you might be in a situation where you in the workplace and you've got a very particular project, you're trying to push towards a particular outcome. I had this experience when I was writing Emotional Agility. You know, you're working weekends, and that value of getting a particular message out or that value of your career is front and center. But it doesn't mean that the other parts of the diamond don't exist. It doesn't mean that then there's conflict with your value of family. So when you kind of move away from this idea of values being in conflict, you start recognizing that actually what's very often in conflict are your goals. Not your values, your goals. You know, my goal, because I've got this big project, is to be at work at a particular time, and it just happens to be that time is, you know, very late on a Thursday night. And I also have a value or a goal in the situation of being at my child's school concert. It's not the value that's in conflict, it's the goal that as human beings who cannot be in two places at once, and yet we always beat ourselves up about the fact that we can't be in two places at once. I've got these two goals that are in conflict. And when you're moving towards understanding that it's not your values and conflicts, it's more your goals, you can start making much cleaner decisions. You can start saying, well, I do need to be at work on this Thursday night, and I am going to miss this event of my child's, but how can I still move towards that value of my child, but in other ways? Maybe I can stream into their concert while I'm working, or maybe I can FaceTime them, or maybe I can video it and watch them. So you start becoming a little bit more creative instead of being locked in this idea of values conflict. So that's the first thing that I hear. Another one, which is what you describe, is that often people find it really difficult to think about what are their values and ways of starting to connect with this. And by the way, it's a fairly common thing, because when we're busy and we're running around and we go from holiday to school to, job to promotion to, life can get so busy. And then we look around and we're like, I don't know what my values are. And it's a really common experience. And so the kinds of things that I encourage people to do is to start saying things like simple questions. What today was worth my while? What was worthwhile for me today? What was worth my time? And that's a different question from what made me feel good, because sometimes the things that make us feel good, like we might go to a party and have fun, are not the things that are worthwhile, that were like truly worth my while. Sometimes stuff that's difficult and that didn't come easily to us and that was tough was worth our while. And so if you start asking yourself questions like, what today was worth my while, that can start pointing us in the direction of our values. And in my book, I've got a whole lot of questions. I just want to lastly, I feel like I'm, talking about this a lot, but I want to lastly, what you were talking about with your friend with being prompt. What's really interesting is the way that I described earlier is we can sometimes get hooked by our emotions. We can sometimes get hooked by cynicism or difficulty, and it starts to be something that we brood on and we get stuck in. And so we can also sometimes become overly fused with our values. And so, you might be someone who values being prompt, but who also values relationships. And those, it's not that the values are in conflict, but you might find that if you demand promptness, that sometimes what it does is it brings up conflict with people. And so what that person is then often navigating is, again, I've got these two values. They're not values that are in conflict, but sometimes I may choose in a particular situation to be flexible about promptness because of my love for this person and my wanting to kind of be with them in a way that feels free and easy. And so anyway, it's a really interesting conversation, but I think important for us as humans to move away from this idea that values are in conflict, because that's very constricting. And I think it's not really how we experience our values. Really, it's often about the situations, the goals in that situation that are in conflict.
It's a really great point. It made me think of my own life where I see, parallel core values. Work's very important to me. Family is very important to me, and at different times, one takes priority. There's certain times of the year when I don't come home until my kids are asleep. There's other times when I'm just full-time, full-on dad. And it took me a long time to really understand that they weren't in conflict. It was just a matter of priorities and different times, and they're operating in tandem. They don't necessarily need to combat each other.
Yeah, and this again draws us as human beings to recognize the beauty and the messiness and the complexity of us as humans. We don't come neatly packaged with only good emotions. We don't come neatly packaged with one value that never pulls us away from a different way of being. We as human beings are big enough and beautiful enough to have all of our emotions. And we are big enough and beautiful enough to have many different values. And sometimes what that does is it brings us into a stark choice of, I've got this goal versus that goal, and this goal is connected with that value, and that other goal is connected with another value. But there's also really power in making choices, because making choices allows us to assert a particular way of being, allows us to assert that this is an action that's important to us. And there's something incredibly beautiful in a human saying, I've got these two goals that are in front of me right now, but I choose this particular goal, as opposed to, I've got these goals in front of me and they connect with values of conflict, and I'm just going to choose the one, but then I'm going to keep regretting it, which is often what we do to ourselves.
You know, Susan, I love this topic. I'm just getting into your book and really enjoying it. I've spent most of my career focused on physical health, and I've very quickly realized that the real elephant in the room in most cases is mental and emotional health, and I know I certainly haven't spent enough time on it. I'm guessing most of our listeners haven't either. So for people who would like to follow you, check out your book, connect with you online, where's the best place for them to go?
Yes, so I'll give you three resources. The first is the book, so Emotional Agility. The second is my TED Talk, just for a brief introduction to some of these ideas in a way that, that TED format, which is called The Gift and Power of Emotional Courage. And then the third is that I've got a free online quiz that over 100,000 people have taken. And really what it does is it asks a couple of questions and then people get a free 10-page report. And people can find that on my website at Susan David, SusanDavid, SusanDavid.com/learn, LEARN.
Back in 2005 and 2006, I was running and eventually owning a yoga studio, and we had a big problem. We needed to staff up. We needed to hire more teachers, and we just couldn't find qualified applicants. Literally, we would put out a job ad, we'd interview a bunch of people, and most quote-unquote certified teachers just couldn't teach a good class. So we started in-house trainings. In fact, my first two courses, there was no paying people at all. We actually sponsored people to take the course, and we hired them, and they became teachers, many of whom are still teachers today, all these years later. And in 2006, we opened up our first course to the public and started training professional teachers, and we used this same approach. The idea was we want people job ready by the end of the course so that we can hire them, or that somebody can hire them. And interestingly enough, this was one of the only courses in the world that was actually training professional teachers. Most yoga courses, you sing some songs, you eat some lentils, and you get a certificate. At our course, you actually learn professional skills, public speaking, applied anatomy, nutrition, physiology, all of the skills that local yoga students are looking for. That's why our graduates are among the highest paid, most employed, most successful teachers in the world. This year we have our 4,000th graduate completing our programs, and it's one of the things that brings me the most joy in all the work that I do. We have a bunch of programs I'd encourage you to check out if you're thinking about becoming a yoga teacher in 2019, and all of them can be found at yogateacherscollege.com, yogateacherscollege.com/calendar to see all of our upcoming events. We have courses as short as 1 week and as long as 6 months, and we even have online training programs for those of you who can't travel to train with us. Hope that's helpful, and I look forward to talking with you more and hopefully training with you sometime in the future here in the upcoming year. This week's nutritional tip is in response to a listener question. Listener Lydia says, Lucas, I heard you mention that one health guru online was taking 300 supplements per day. I also saw that photo. This seems crazy. How many supplements should you be taking? This is a really difficult question to answer, and the answer is as much as you need and as little as possible. The reason being is that adding tons and tons of variables to your body is just not a great idea. You'll see these biohackers and stuff showing off on Instagram with a mouthful of pills. And I just, what that means is if you swallow 30 pills at once or 300 pills a day like this particular guy was doing, you'll end up with a bloated belly sitting on the toilet and you won't digest any of your food for that day. Nobody can handle 3 grams of vitamin C and 1,000 milligrams of magnesium citrate, and nobody can handle all that stuff. Your digestive tract just blows up. So the gating factor is always your GI tract. And you want to take as little as possible and as much as you need. So what do you need? Well, almost everybody listening needs vitamin D3. Go get some blood work done. You'll find that you're deficient. Almost everybody needs omega-3s. Again, get some blood work done if you'd like to, or just jump on the bandwagon. You're almost likely deficient because almost all of us are. Almost everyone listening could benefit from some vitamin K2 that goes along with that goes along with that vitamin D3, and a B vitamin complex. It's interesting. This is the same stack that people often give pregnant women, that an OBGYN will give pregnant women. And so somehow we take really great care of expecting mothers. And then after that, now we say, whatever you want. Now go back to drinking and Haagen-Dazs. If this is the ideal stack for fertility, I'm going to take this all year round, right? Because I want to have the ideal conditions in my body all the time, not just when conception is the goal or when, staving off, brainstem disorders and things like this. These things are so commonly deficient that this is what a typical prenatal stack will include. B complex vitamins, vitamin D3 and K2, omega-3s, and in other cases, other things as well. Sometimes we put on iron and things like that, but you should not use iron unless you know you need it. So I'll reiterate, vitamin D3/K2, omega-3s, and then a B vitamin complex. The reason that they'll stick expecting mothers on these is because deficiencies are so common, and deficiencies can totally screw up a young kid, and they can totally screw you up too. They're really cheap and inexpensive to fix. That stack together will cost you, 50 cents per day maximum, so definitely less than any beverage that you're drinking, and it'll give you way more bang for your buck. Now that said, when you're starting off with that baseline stack, you should still pay attention to your digestion, pay attention to your sleep. If I take vitamin D before bed, I don't sleep well, for example. You have to figure out what works for you, and you have to really pay attention. Just because it's natural or a vitamin or because it's available over the counter doesn't mean it can't totally screw up your digestive tract or even your health. So pay attention to what's going on. Now, at different times in your life, you might need to supplement with iron. You might need to supplement with vitamin C or vitamin E. You might need even more intense things like iron and things like this, but you need to really take as little as you can and as much as you need. Get your blood work done. Find a trusted healthcare provider and get the advice. I think it's really foolish for people who don't take anything. That just means you're not paying attention. Go get your blood work done and see, and you'll find you're deficient in something. Maybe it's zinc, for sure it's vitamin D, and really quickly you'll get an idea about what you need to take. But pay attention to adverse reactions and respond accordingly. With B vitamins, a lot of people will get gas and bloating. I'd encourage you to switch brands and in some cases break up your B stack. So I take B12 separately, for example. In different cases, you might take different B complex vitamins separately to avoid GI discomfort. I hope that's helpful. We have a question from a listener this week. Listener says, Lucas, I've been listening to most of your podcasts. I am of the opinion that you're the most trustworthy and genuine voice on the net. Well, thanks for that. Certainly, I've been inspired in my approach to yoga and possibly at this moment in time, more importantly, diet. I've been hearing you talk about lean and it has led me to revolutionize my way of eating. I'm one of those people that over the years has changed, altered, and played around with my diet for the usual reasons, ethics, politics, health, and without actually without ever affiliating with any group. Interesting. I have been vegetarian vegan since my 20s. I'm now 62, but along the way, some kind of paleo without having heard of this movement until recently. I think my search has been for authenticity. Well, in spite of the fact that my wife, she's 50, and I believed it to be healthy, eating whole grain, organic, unprocessed food, we seem to arrive at a state of somewhat less lean. From my early 20s, I studied fanatically martial arts, yoga, and meditation. 10 years ago, I learned to swim, and now I go most mornings. I am not so much sporty or a health fanatic, but I love the art of things more. Inspired by our podcast, 7 weeks ago, I went keto. Just for listeners, keto is a ketosis, and keto is kind of the nickname like paleo. In a ketogenic diet, just so you get an example or get an idea, it usually requires about 80% fat. It's a very difficult way to eat. I'll carry on. Actually, 9 weeks ago, I went on your 8+16 intermittent fasting routine and dropped all the carbs and hit the fat. Initially, the results were amazing. I couldn't believe how great I felt, clear, lighter, and maybe 10 to 20 years younger. And in the mirror, my shape has definitely changed. Although not so much interested in weight, it seems I have lost 14 pounds. As you can imagine, we bought keto books, read everything on the web, etc. At this moment, things seem to have slowed up, and whilst I have religiously and without discomfort stuck with the 8+16 meal timing, I have recently been reading the work of Stephen Phinney, who, as you know, is one of the early pioneers of keto and is very much still active in the field, who says that fasting can be counterproductive. Well, for me in the beginning, I was never hungry. In fact, I have done quite a few 24-hour fasts because I forgot to eat. But now suddenly it seems I am waking up hungry and get hungry before my second meal in the evening. I am taking all the supplements you recommend, and I've increased my sodium intake. I don't really know where to go from here to tweak things. There's a handful of waist flab that needs to go before you could describe this body as approaching lean. I guess I kind of know that you won't reply to this, but if you do, I'd like to add another question. It refers to toenail fungus. Okay, a whole bunch of different questions here. Let me jump in at the start. So, in terms of becoming lean, this is a really great goal. A lot of times people say they want to lose weight. Many times people actually need to gain weight. They just need to lose body fat. So many people will change their body composition and they will look a lot lighter. They will look like they've lost weight, and they've actually gained weight because they reduce body fat and gain lean muscle. And as you know, of course, lean muscle weighs a lot more than body fat. So this approach to trying to get lean is really valid. And some people do it just for aesthetic reasons, but there are very valid health reasons. Lean, meaning having a low body fat percentage, so higher muscle mass to body fat ratio, is really correlated with healthy metabolism, healthy endocrine system, longevity, lower risk of heart disease, and all the blood glucose related conditions. So it's definitely a good goal. And as a bonus, you look better and you look younger as well too. So what happened here is this listener went on a ketogenic diet. Again, let me dip a little bit further into this. I first learned about ketosis when I started studying seizure disorders, and this was way back in the late 90s. And I started experimenting with ketosis. The way I would go into ketosis is I would eat basically nothing, and then I would eat really heavy cream. And that was sort of the way I would get into ketosis. There's fasting-induced ketosis, where you just don't eat for a while. Usually it takes about 24 hours to go into slight ketosis. And then there is dietary-induced ketosis. That's where you're eating so much fat, your body doesn't know the difference between eating and not eating, and it goes into this ketogenic state. Think of the three main macronutrients: fat, protein, and carbs. There's a fourth mysterious nutrient called ketones, and your body creates ketones by metabolizing fat. It's a way that your body gets energy from its own stores, and your body, even a very lean body, has tremendous amount of energy, days and days, if not weeks, worth of stored energy in body fat, and it frees that up through ketosis. The analogy I always give, or the anecdotal story I always share with people that gets you into this idea: imagine that you're with a newborn, or let's say a 6-month-old baby, even sometimes toddlers. They will go to bed very early. They might go to bed 6 or 7 o'clock, and even though they rarely sleep through the night, maybe they get up a couple of times, by the morning, oftentimes they can go in easily 12 hours without eating, and not uncommon for a toddler age child who starts to go down through the whole night, might go 12, 14, or even 14 hours plus without eating. Now, when you go to pick that kid up from the crib, their breath smells a little bit like sour fruit, a little bit like sweet applesauce. Those are ketones that you're smelling on a healthy person. Ketones can be really offensive on somebody who's pretty toxic, but on somebody like a baby, it's even a pleasant smell, but it's a very distinct smell, and those are ketones. Those are acetone byproducts that you're smelling on the breath. It's one of the ways that your body is in ketosis, one of the signs. There's also biomarkers in blood and urine and things like this as well, but breath is one of them. So children go into ketosis really regularly. And in fact, as kids get older, a 12-hour turnaround between last and first meal is very common, and a kid has a really healthy blood glucose tolerance in general, so they'll dip into ketosis for a little bit, really, really light ketosis. First thing you need to know about the keto movement is almost nobody in the keto movement is actually in ketosis. I'll say that again. Almost nobody in the keto movement is actually in ketosis. Just like almost nobody who says they're vegetarian actually doesn't eat meat, and just like almost all the paleo people are not actually paleo. That's just an ideal scenario. That's the ideal world that they're aiming for. Ketosis is really difficult to get into, so even by doing 8+16 meal timing, most people dip into ketosis just barely or even not at all. And so it shouldn't be confused that 8+16 is a ketogenic diet. It's just not. For some people, they'll dip into slight ketosis. For some people, not at all. To get into ketosis, most people require a really, really high-fat diet, 80% plus, and really have to throttle your carbs, like less than 50, sometimes even less than 20 grams per day. It's very, very restrictive. Now, why would you do this? Well, ketogenic diet is not a natural way to eat by any stretch of the imagination, but neither is any of the ways that we eat, so why not experiment with this? The reason I don't think you should experiment with this long term is simply because it's so aggressive. It's a therapeutic way of eating to treat things like neurological problems, for example, like seizure disorders, epilepsy, and things like this. It's a way to use a sledgehammer to reset your endocrine system. So if your blood insulin levels, if some of your inflammation markers are all out of whack, it can be a real sledgehammer to get you back to a really healthy zone. And it can really counteract years and years of screwed up eating patterns in perhaps weeks or months. It's really effective. And as this listener noted, your body composition changes very, very fast. The long-term effects of ketogenic diet are really unknown, and there's even some things to suggest that it's maybe negative, particularly for women. I don't teach ketogenic diet. I don't advocate a ketogenic diet. I'm not against it. I just think it should be used therapeutically, and it's really aggressive. And part of the reason I think it's misguided is because I meet people who claim to be keto all the time, and they're just not. And so if you're actually doing, blood ketone tests, you'll see that most people just are not in ketosis. But still, having intermittent fasting, eat, stop, eat, having a nice fasting window, at least 12 hours, the minimum turnaround, really, really dramatic results really quickly. So it sounds like, listener, that you're stuck with the weight loss component. Now, keep in mind, you're 62 years old, and so this is going to make everything you're trying to do a little more challenging than me, who's 40, for example. Maybe a lot more challenging, if we're being honest. It sounds like you've done a lot of experiments. It sounds like you've been experimenting with this for a while. You already lost 14 pounds. It sounds like what you're doing is really, really great. My big suggestion is to don't go so extreme with the keto, because that can really have a bounce back effect. Like you've started to notice, you're getting all these hunger pains. Hunger is not a bad thing, but if it's causing you to eat things that you don't want to eat, that is a bad thing. But it's normal to feel hungry and tired and horny, and all these things. These are human biorhythms. We all have these feelings. So if you're tapping back into those, that's definitely healthy. But again, if it's making you bounce back and you're eating foods that you wouldn't normally eat, again, that can be a rebound effect of ketosis, which is pretty common. The guy who's done the most work with this is Dr. Peter Attia, really interesting guy. Pretty dense work, but he has a very dense website and a very dense podcast. If you want to really deep dive into ketosis, he's the guy I trust more than anybody out there. He went for 3 years into strict ketosis, and it's just interesting. So if you really want to deep dive into ketosis, that's the only guy I would pay attention to personally. Really great reference. So those are my thoughts in terms of leaning out, throttling your carbs long-term, really important, resetting your metabolism, which means getting your fasting blood glucose down, getting your inflammation markers down, getting your sensitivity to leptin, insulin up, so you're very sensitive. You can metabolize sugars, and doing some adding some high intensity exercise here and there can really be helpful as well. It sounds like you're just doing amazing things all around. So you're losing weight, you're going swimming, whatever's happening. It sounds like you're doing awesome. So I wouldn't be too worried. Did want to address this last part of the question, which you had about toenail fungus. It's a bunch of stuff. Modern medicine's awesome. We can, in many cases, we can cure cancer. It really does happen, right? Sometimes cancer can be cured with allopathic medicine. Sometimes, definitely bacterial infections, staphylococcus. You take some amoxicillin and boom, it's gone. It's amazing. Modern medicine is amazing. There's a bunch of things that are not amazing. And I'll give you an example. Jock itch, dandruff, toenail fungus, we have no cures for these. Now, there are prescription medications, and what I will tell you is that the prescriptions have gotten better. In the old days, they were really dangerous to your liver, and you actually had to get liver tests before you could go on these things. But like modern versions of Lamisil, that's the brand name, the chemical name is something like terbinafine, something like that. I'm not sure how to say the name, terbinafine, Lamisil. These have now gotten very safe, and they're not so dangerous on your liver, and they're generally regarded as safe. Definitely check with your dermatologist. But you have to combine these with a throttled carb diet, like what you're doing now. The reason that people have yeast infections for 10 years, the reason people have toenail infections for 10 years and jock itch for 10 years, is because even if you take a really strong prescription medication, the underlying problem, the food for that fungal overgrowth, for that bacterial overgrowth, for that small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, the food for it, the sugar is still present in your system, so boom, it just hits it. And so you have to combine, the best way to do is to combine a prescription medication with a long period of throttled carb intake. So exactly what you're doing combined with some medication can really be helpful. And my biggest suggestion would be you got to go for the long haul. And so like these Lamisil products, you have to take them for something crazy. It's like because I taught yoga for so long too, my toenails got messed up for years. And this is the exact protocol that I took. I went on Lamisil for something like 5 months, which is not what I wanted to do, but I just got sick of having crazy toenails. And I also throttled my carbs massively, and that was the only thing that really shifted, and I tried everything else. You'll see all kinds of wacky cures and things on the internet. None of that stuff works. None of the lasers, none of that. It's an internal problem, and your body needs a little kickstart to get over, and that's where the prescriptions come in. I've never seen somebody cure this naturally. I just never have seen it. It's chronic and it lasts forever, unless you have a big shift in your life, or unless you get a little boost from something prescription. So I'd go suggest you talk to a dermatologist and use what you're doing in terms of this carb throttling, and I think you'll get some pretty good results. But keep in mind, it's a long game. You need to be on this cycle for 4 or 5 months. It'll take you a year before you have that full kind of changeover of your toenails. Hope that's helpful.
This week's iTunes review is by Anjali Singh from the US. Anjali Singh says, "Thank you, Lucas, for sharing the knowledge about almost every important thing in the world. I love listening to your podcast while running, and recently started listening at home. I learned a lot about wellness of the body and aspects related to yoga. I love sharing the information with loved ones. Keep sharing and bending. Namaste." Anjali Singh, you have won the Yoga Trapeze. Email us at podcast@yogabody.com and we'll get that out to you.
Breathing is one of the fastest and most powerful ways you can affect your nervous system, the pH of your blood, even your endocrine system. It's really dramatic how quickly you can impact your body, but most people don't understand it. If you go to yoga classes, the teacher just says, breathe deeply, breathe slowly. And we don't really understand what that means. I got really frustrated with this, so I put together a guide for you, my podcast listeners. Go to yogabody.com/how to breathe. Yogabody.com/how to breathe. You put in your email, and I'll give you this PDF. It shows you exactly how to do water, whiskey, and coffee breathing. These 3 specific practices, which all breathing falls into one of these 3 categories. Check it out. Let me know what you think. Yogabody.com/how to breathe.